My parents mocked me for my career choice. A few years later, I owned the company. A story of determination, perseverance, and turning dreams into reality. I still remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Sunday dinner in our suburban home outside Chicago, the kind of dinner where my parents gathered the family to discuss important matters. My mother had made her famous pot roast, the one she saved for special occasions, and my father sat at the head of the table with that familiar stern expression he wore whenever he was about to deliver a lecture. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in digital marketing and a burning passion that consumed every waking moment of my existence. I had just received an offer to join a small creative agency downtown, not as an executive, not in some prestigious corner office, but as a junior strategist making barely enough to cover rent in a cramped studio apartment. By conventional standards, it was a modest beginning. But to me it was everything. When I announced my decision, the room fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of a family moment, but that heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes disappointment. My father set down his fork slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of his judgment needed a physical anchor. My mother's jaw tightened, her hands clutching the edge of the dining table. "A creative agency?" my father said, his voice carrying that particular tone of disbelief I had grown to recognize throughout my childhood. "That's not a real career. That's what people do when they can't figure out what they actually want to do with their lives." My younger brother looked down at his plate. My sister bit her lip, already knowing this conversation would spiral into the kind of family tension that would linger for weeks. Nobody dared interrupt my father when he was making a point. He continued, his words sharp and precise like surgical cuts. "You went to a good university. Your mother and I sacrificed everything to give you opportunities. And this is what you choose. Marketing? Do you understand how unstable that is? How competitive? How many people try to make it in that field and end up working at retail stores or waiting tables?" My mother added her own voice to the chorus, softer but somehow more piercing. "Sweetheart, we just want you to be secure. A real job, something with benefits, a 401k advancement, something respectable that you can explain to people at parties without feeling embarrassed." I sat there, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on my chest like a physical force. My hands trembled slightly as I held my fork. I had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in my mind, preparing arguments and counterpoints, but facing their genuine disappointment, all my carefully constructed defenses crumbled. "I'm going to make it work," I said quietly, my voice lacking the conviction I felt internally. My father laughed, not a warm laugh but a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed through the dining room. "That's what everyone says. That's what dreamers always say." And then reality hits and they realize they should have listened to their parents. The rest of dinner passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and forced small talk about the weather and neighborhood gossip. But I had made my decision. I was going to prove them wrong even if it took everything I had. I started that job 2 weeks later on a Monday morning in late August. The agency was located in a renovated warehouse in the West Loop, the kind of space that screamed creative ambition with its exposed brick walls, mismatched furniture, and walls covered in inspiration boards and client work. I felt alive there in a way I had never felt in my parents' structured, predictable world. But I also felt the weight of their words. Every time I encountered a setback, and in those early months there were many, I heard my father's voice in my head, telling me I had made a mistake. Every time I stretched my paycheck to cover rent and student loans, I remembered my mother's concern about stability. I was determined to silence those voices. Not by proving them right, but by proving them so spectacularly wrong that there would be no doubt, no lingering "I told you so" in their eyes. I was going to succeed and I was going to do it on my own terms. That determination became my fuel. It was the force that kept me working until midnight, analyzing data and crafting strategies. It was what drove me to take online courses on my own dime, to learn skills that would make me indispensable. It was the quiet rage that answered every moment of doubt with a simple, unshakable resolve. I will make this work. Looking back now, I realize that their mockery, as painful as it was, became the greatest gift they could have given me. It gave me a target, a clear enemy to overcome. And I was willing to do whatever it took. The first year at the agency was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just working, I was drowning myself in work, using it as both a shield against my parents' judgment and a weapon to build the skills I knew I would need. My typical day started at 6 a.m. I would wake up in my studio apartment, a place so small that my bed nearly touched the opposite wall, and go through the same routine. Shower. Coffee from the coffee maker I'd bought at a thrift store. A quick breakfast of eggs and toast. Then I'd spend an hour before the official workday began studying whatever I had decided was my weakness that week. Social media algorithms. Data analysis. Copywriting. Brand psychology. I was obsessed with becoming invaluable. The agency itself was a fascinating ecosystem. It had about 40 employees, ranging from burnt-out veterans who had been in the industry for decades to eager young creatives like myself. The owner was a man named David Chin, a visionary in his 50s who had built the agency from nothing during the early days of digital marketing. He was demanding but fair, and he had an almost supernatural ability to see potential in people before they saw it in themselves. My manager was a woman named Sarah, brilliant and exacting, who didn't suffer fools or laziness. She took one look at my work in those first weeks and raised an eyebrow. "You're trying too hard," she told me bluntly during a strategy meeting. "Your analysis is solid, but you're overcomplicating things. The best strategy is the one that works, not the one that sounds the most impressive." That feedback stung, but it was exactly what I needed. I started simplifying my approach, focusing on results rather than complexity. And my work improved dramatically. Within 6 months, I had been assigned to lead a small client account, a mid-sized e-commerce company selling sustainable fashion. They were struggling with brand awareness and had a budget barely large enough to make a dent in the competitive digital landscape. Most people would have seen it as a thankless task. I saw it as an opportunity to prove something. I became obsessed with understanding that client. I studied their competitors obsessively. I analyzed their customer base with surgical precision. I spent hours on their website thinking about every button, every image, every word choice. I interviewed their founder, a woman named Michelle who had started the company from her garage because she couldn't find clothes that aligned with her environmental values. Her story moved me. Here was another woman defying expectations, building something real in a world that didn't always make room for unconventional dreams. I decided that I was going to make her company succeed not because it was my job, but because her story deserved to be heard. I developed a strategy focused on authentic storytelling. Rather than traditional advertising, I created content that highlighted the real people behind the brand. The artisans who created the fabrics, the workers in the factories, Michelle's own journey from environmental activist to entrepreneur. I used a combination of Instagram stories, YouTube documentaries, and blog posts to weave a narrative that was compelling and genuine. The results came slowly at first. A few hundred new followers. A modest uptick in website traffic. But I kept pushing, refining, iterating. I stayed late into the evenings, sometimes until 9 or 10 p.m., working on content that I believed in. My apartment became a second office, my laptop perpetually open, my phone constantly buzzing with notifications. My friends from college started to drift away during this period. They were getting apartments together, going out to bars on Friday nights, taking weekend trips. I was saying yes to their invitations less and less frequently. When I did go out, I was distracted thinking about analytics and engagement rates. I felt the isolation acutely, but I also felt the momentum building. By month 9, the e-commerce company had experienced a 340% increase in website traffic. Their conversion rate had more than doubled. They were adding staff to keep up with orders. Michelle called me personally to thank me, and I heard genuine tears in her voice as she told me what my work had meant to her business. That moment, that single moment of hearing someone say that my work had changed their life, made every late night worth it. It made the sacrifice, the isolation, the constant grinding feel meaningful. But success at work didn't translate to financial security as quickly as I had hoped. I was still living paycheck to paycheck. My parents would occasionally call, their conversations peppered with subtle jabs about whether I was still doing the marketing thing. My father had once asked, in that particular way he had of phrasing judgments as questions, "Don't you think it's time to consider something more stable?" Each comment lit a fire inside me. I was going to prove them wrong. I was going to build something so successful that they would have no choice but to acknowledge my choice had been right all along. The problem was that even though I was proving myself at the agency, I was still an employee. I was still building someone else's business. David Chin paid me well. My salary had increased significantly, but I wasn't building wealth. I was building a resume. And somewhere around month 14, I realized something crucial. If I truly wanted to prove myself, I couldn't do it working for someone else. I needed to start my own agency. The thought terrified me. It also exhilarated me. I was barely 25 years old. I had no savings to speak of. I had no business experience beyond what I'd learned from observation. But I had something more valuable. I had proven to myself that I could create results. I had real case studies. I had a portfolio that could speak for itself. I spent 3 months planning in secret, working late into the nights on a business plan that outlined everything. Market analysis, competitive positioning, service offerings, financial projections. I researched loans and grants for small business owners. I talked to other entrepreneurs, picking their brains about what they wished they had known when they started. The night I decided to tell David Chin that I was leaving, I barely slept. I had written and rewritten my resignation letter a dozen times. I was about to walk away from a secure job, steady income, and the validation of working for an established agency. But I was also about to bet on myself in a way that my parents said was foolish. And that made it feel absolutely necessary. I walked into David Chen's office on a Thursday morning in October, my resignation letter folded in my jacket pocket. I had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but my heart was still pounding as I closed the door behind me. Through the glass walls of his office, I could see the rest of the agency going about their day. People typing, talking on calls, creating the work that had consumed my life for the past 18 months. David looked up from his computer screen, adjusting his glasses. He was a man who could read people with uncanny accuracy, and I'm certain he saw something in my face before I even spoke. "I'm leaving," I said simply. No preamble, no softening. Just the truth. He leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he smiled, not a congratulatory smile but a knowing one. "You're starting your own agency." It wasn't a question. I nodded, surprised that he had seen it coming. "I thought you might," he said. "You have the hunger for it. The drive. You've learned what you needed to learn here." He paused and his expression became more serious. "It's going to be harder than you think. You know that, right?" I told him I did, though honestly, I'm not sure I fully comprehended what lay ahead. How could I have? I was 25 years old and I was about to attempt something that statistically had a high likelihood of failure. I gave 2 weeks' notice, but the conversation with David had shifted something in me. He didn't try to convince me to stay. Instead, he treated my departure as a natural progression, even offering introductions to some of his contacts who might become clients. That validation meant more to me than I could articulate. The night I told my parents, I called them on the phone rather than visiting in person. I knew I needed distance for this conversation, the kind of distance that would allow me to hold my ground without being physically present to absorb the weight of their disappointment. "I'm starting my own marketing agency," I announced, my voice steadier than I felt. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "With what capital?" my father asked finally, his practical mind immediately jumping to financial logistics. "My savings, a small business loan and sweat equity," I replied. "That's insane," he said flatly. "You have a good job. You're throwing away security." My mother came on the extension, her voice tinged with worry. "Honey, most small businesses fail. Do you understand that? We just don't want to see you get hurt." "I understand," I said, and I meant it. I did understand their fear. But understanding it didn't mean accepting it. "I'm going to do this anyway." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the blank walls, wondering if they were right, if I was making a catastrophic mistake. But then I remembered Michelle's tears when she told me what my work had meant to her. I remembered the feeling of seeing a strategy one had developed actually create real, measurable impact in the world. And I knew that no amount of parental disapproval could make me walk away from that. Starting the agency was a mastermind of chaos and ingenuity born from necessity. I couldn't afford a real office, so I worked from my apartment and from coffee shops around the city. I couldn't afford employees, so I learned to do everything myself. Strategy, copywriting, design, analytics, client management. I took online courses in graphic design at night. I taught myself basic web development through YouTube tutorials. I became a generalist out of pure necessity. My first client was Michelle, the sustainable fashion entrepreneur I had worked with at the previous agency. She believed in me enough to take a chance, and she signed a contract that would have been insulting if I hadn't been so desperate for the cash flow. But it was something. It was real. I worked from my apartment in those early days, often for 15 or 16 hours at a time. My studio apartment became a physical manifestation of my obsession. Whiteboards on every wall covered in notes, folders stacked on every surface, my laptop permanently open on the only table I owned. I ate cheap meals. I didn't go out. I didn't date. I didn't do anything that didn't directly contribute to the success of the agency. Within 3 months I had signed 3 more clients. Within 6 months I had 7. Not through traditional marketing, I couldn't afford that, but through word-of-mouth, case studies, and the undeniable proof that my work created results. The first year of the agency was financially devastating. I made less money than I had made at my previous job and I was working twice as hard. There were months where I wasn't sure I would be able to pay rent. I moved to a cheaper apartment, a place in a less desirable neighborhood where the walls were thin and the building had a persistent smell of cooking oil and old carpet. I bought clothes from thrift stores. I made my own coffee instead of buying it. Every penny counted. But something remarkable was happening. My clients were thriving. One boutique clothing brand saw a 500% increase in social media engagement. A local restaurant that had been struggling with foot traffic became a destination spot after I rebuilt their brand identity and created a viral marketing campaign around their unique story. A nonprofit focused on youth education quadrupled their donor base through a storytelling initiative I developed. The work was meaningful in a way that my previous job, secure and well compensated as it was, had never been. I wasn't just executing strategies for large corporations. I was helping small business owners achieve their dreams. I was creating tangible change in people's lives. And slowly something shifted. Other agencies started calling me, asking if I was available for freelance work on their larger clients. Speaking opportunities started appearing. Small marketing conferences wanted me to talk about my approach to authentic brand storytelling. LinkedIn articles I wrote in my spare time started getting shared widely. By the end of the second year, I had 12 full-time clients and a waiting list. I moved out of my apartment and rented a small office space, just 300 square feet, but it felt like a palace compared to my studio. I hired my first employee, a recent college graduate named Marcus who had the same hunger I had possessed when I was his age. That's when I started to notice something in my parents' tone when they called. The subtle shift from dismissal to curiosity. My mother asked detailed questions about my clients. My father, in his own way, started asking about my revenue projections and growth strategy. I didn't mention these shifts to them. I didn't need their validation anymore. But I noticed it, and somewhere deep inside it mattered. By year 3, I had 6 employees and a portfolio of work that was genuinely impressive. I had turned down more clients than I accepted. I was finally making enough money to live comfortably, to save, to actually build wealth. The agency was profitable, sustainable, and growing. But more importantly, I was building something that mattered. Something that was entirely my own. 5 years after I left David Chen's agency, I received a call that changed everything. It was David himself, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this wasn't a casual check-in. "I'm retiring," he said without preamble. "I'm selling the agency, and I wanted to give you the first opportunity to buy it." I was sitting at my desk in my modest office downtown, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The agency where I had learned everything, the place where I had been dismissed and doubted but also where I had discovered my capabilities, was being offered to me. Not as an employee. Not as a junior strategist. But as a potential owner. The asking price was substantial. Far more than I had in liquid capital. But David wasn't offering it as a test or a joke. He was offering it as recognition of what I had built, what I had become. He believed I could do it. I spent the next month analyzing numbers obsessively. I consulted with a business advisor. I explored financing options. I ran projections until my eyes blurred. And I realized something fundamental. This wasn't really a financial decision. It was a symbolic one. Buying that agency meant closing a circle. It meant taking the place where my journey had begun and transforming it into something that reflected who I had become. I secured a combination of bank financing and an investment from a venture capitalist who had been following my work. The deal closed on a cold February morning. I walked into that same warehouse in the West Loop where I had started 5 years earlier, but this time, I wasn't an anxious 23-year-old junior strategist. I was the owner. Sarah, my former manager, was the first person I hired to stay. She had been contemplating her own departure when David announced the sale, but I convinced her to stay and help me build something new. Together, we mapped out a vision for the agency that honored its legacy while propelling it into a future that reflected the lessons I had learned building my own company. We expanded the team strategically, bringing in people who shared our commitment to authentic storytelling and meaningful work. We restructured our service offerings to focus on impact rather than volume. We turned down lucrative contracts that didn't align with our values. And we invested heavily in developing the next generation of marketers, people like Marcus, who had been my first employee and was now a senior strategist. The transformation was challenging. Some of David's old clients left because we were raising standards and prices. Some of his employees didn't fit with the new direction and moved on. But the agency became something extraordinary. Within 2 years of my acquisition, we had doubled revenue and tripled profitability. Our client retention rate was 95%. Our employee satisfaction scores were among the highest in the industry. But the real turning point came on a Sunday evening, almost exactly 5 years after that fateful dinner where my parents had mocked my career choice. I was at my parents' house for dinner, something that had become a regular occurrence as my success had made them more comfortable in my presence. My father had even started bragging about me to his friends, though he did it in that particular way of his, as if my success was something that reflected well on his parenting rather than something I had achieved despite their doubts. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, my mother having cleared the dishes while my father and I discussed business in a way that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. My younger brother and sister were there too, and the conversation had shifted to my upcoming acquisition of a second office location. "It's remarkable, really," my father said, and I heard something in his voice that I had never heard before. Not condescension. Not doubt. but a kind of genuine pride. I'll admit, I didn't think you would make it. When you told us about the marketing agency, I was convinced you were making a mistake. I thought you would fail, and I was prepared to help you pick up the pieces. My mother reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture that suggested she had been waiting for him to say this for a very long time. But you didn't fail, he continued. You didn't just survive. You built something real. Something that matters. And then you had the vision to recognize an opportunity and take it. That takes a kind of courage and conviction that I didn't give you credit for. I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, which surprised me. I had thought I was past needing their validation. But hearing my father acknowledge that he had been wrong, truly wrong, about my path meant something profound. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about them finally understanding why I had been right. I'm sorry, he said, and those words felt like they carried the weight of 5 years of doubt and dismissal. I'm sorry for not believing in you. I'm sorry for making you feel like your dreams were foolish. I told him it was okay, and I meant it. Because somewhere along the way his skepticism had stopped mattering. I had internalized a belief in myself that no longer required external validation to sustain it. His apology was meaningful, but it was also almost beside the point. I had already proven to myself what I needed to prove. The conversation shifted, and my family began asking me detailed questions about the business. Questions that reflected genuine interest and respect rather than concern or doubt. My mother asked about my employees and whether I was treating them well. My brother asked about my growth strategy. My sister, who had always been my quiet supporter, simply smiled and told me she was proud of me. That night, driving back to my apartment, I thought about the girl who had sat at that same dinner table 5 years earlier, trembling as her parents dismissed her dreams. I thought about the late nights in a cramped studio apartment, the months where I wasn't sure I would survive financially, the times when the weight of their judgment had threatened to crush my resolve. And I realized something profound. Their mockery hadn't been my obstacle. It had been my fuel. Their doubt had given me something concrete to push against, something that transformed abstract ambition into visceral determination. In mocking my choice, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift, a clear reason to succeed. The agency continued to grow. Within 3 years of acquiring it, we had expanded to 3 locations and 45 employees. We were recognized in industry publications as one of the most innovative firms in the country. Speaking engagements came regularly. Offers to consult for larger corporations. Opportunities to mentor younger entrepreneurs. But the moment I'm most proud of didn't come from industry recognition. It came when I promoted Marcus to partner. He was sitting in my office, tears streaming down his face as I explained that I was giving him equity in the company and making him a co-owner. He had reminded me so much of myself. Hungry, driven, hungry to prove something to people who didn't believe in him. I don't know what to say, he said, his voice breaking. You don't have to say anything, I told him. Just do what I did. Take it seriously. Build something that matters. And when you're in a position to do it, help the next person who's hungry like you were. That's what success really means to me now. It's not the money, though the financial security is undeniably important after years of struggle. It's not the prestige or the industry recognition, though those things are validating. Success is the ability to lift other people up, to create opportunities for people who are where I once was, dismissed, doubted, but determined to prove something to themselves in the world. When I think about my parents now, I don't think about their mockery with anger. I think about it with gratitude. They were wrong about me, but they were right about one thing. I needed to be serious about what I was doing. And their skepticism forced me to be more serious, more committed, more driven than I might have been otherwise. The girl who sat at that dinner table, trembling as her dreams were dismissed, would never believe that she would become the owner of the agency that had launched her career. But she would believe this, that the only opinion that ever truly mattered was her own. And once she owned that, nothing else could stop her. Standing in my office now, looking out at the team I've built, the clients we serve, the impact we're creating, I know that the mockery was worth it. The struggle was worth it. And the person I've become because of that struggle is worth everything I sacrificed to get here.